Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And maybe some of you are like, what are you doing, dude? You finished up Matthew yesterday. Like I heard you said the last verse and you were like, boom, that's it. And then it was just quiet after that. And you like just left us with that. I thought we were done. That seemed like a really good place to end. Well, yes. If that felt like the right place to leave it, then don't worry about these next 5 episodes. But these next 5 episodes, which I might add, neatly bring us to 800 total for all of Matthew. These next 5 episodes are the epilogue. This is where we look at the whole big picture of where we've been and where we consider where it all went next. And that's actually what I want to start with today, is just the quick rundown of what happened next. What happened to all of these characters we've come to care about and empathize with? How did stuff turn out for them? How did stuff turn out between the Jewish leadership and Rome? How did their attempt to keep Rome under their thumb, how did all of that play out? There's just a lot of history and there's a lot of stuff. And we, of course, don't have time to deep dive into all of it because, I mean, really to answer the question, what happened next, we'd have to cover events all the way up to and then you and I talked about Matthew and it was this year and this time, because this is really still part of the story. Like what you and I are doing right here, right now, is really part of the story of what happened next, because this flows directly out of the kingdom events that Jesus and the disciples and the resurrection set in motion. So it's a big story, but maybe we'll just go for like the short term, what happened next. All 4 gospel accounts give us basically the same idea. Jesus started to appear to the disciples and to a lot of other people. He was very physically present, though it looked like he had the ability to do some stuff that transcended the physical and at times did. He's always sitting with people and eating food and hanging out. He can physically interact with the world. He's a guy. He's physically resurrected. It's not like this is his spirit walking around. The text holds it out as though he actually rose from the grave. There is no body. The body that he was dragging around with him through his 33 years of life and the one that got absolutely beat to a pulp is restored in the fashion. I mean, we know God has that capacity because we saw Jesus do that in chapter 9 with the paralytic who's lowered through the ceiling. Like that's kind of a foretaste of the restoration of the physical body and even appearance of Jesus after his crucifixion and in the resurrection. That's the guy. That's the body that is hiking around and hanging out with the disciples, as we've talked about. He interacts with them in Jerusalem, but then the story wraps up in Galilee. It looks like a series of weeks after his initial resurrection and his initial appearances. I want to highlight a couple of the details that we get from John, because I don't think we've talked about them yet. And I think they wrap up a loose end that for Matthew's purposes, he was content to leave as a loose end. It helped to illustrate this point of betrayal and abandonment, but also to illustrate that it looks like Matthew, who was there and one of the disciples, is really stressing that this great commissioning, this was a responsibility that was given to all of the disciples to go and see through. So Matthew gives us Peter, that's who we're going to be talking about here, as a point of view character who we can particularly relate to in terms of his failures. But John, here at the very end in chapter 21, he gives us a few more details on Jesus specifically restoring Peter. And in a lot of ways, you wait for those details as you read straight through the Gospels all the way until the very end of the Gospels. But Jesus goes out of his way to deal with what went wrong there. John 21, what verse is that? 15 says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. And Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Isn't this just so in keeping with the relationship between Jesus and Peter that we saw in Matthew, that kind of stubbornness, that thick-headedness? It's a little bit hard to get through to Peter at times, and at times Jesus is using very jarring means. Get behind me, Satan. At other times, he's using more nurturing means. This is a Peter who doesn't look as eager to go big and know all the things at this point. It seems like his character has evolved. He's been humbled. And rather than getting all worked up, his response to being asked the question 3 times is to be hurt. Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. I tell you the truth. When you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you don't want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved, presumably that's John, seems like that's how he refers to himself throughout his gospel, was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" And then Jesus answered, "I don't know if I want him to remain alive until I return. What is that to you? You must follow me." And then John acknowledges that there was some kind of rumor about him not dying. Now, John is the one who lived the longest. So it looks like chapter 21 is something that maybe was written as part of the full initial edition of John. I don't think it's heretical or failing to be in keeping with Christian historical doctrine of the inspiration of Scripture to suggest that it took John a while to write this, and maybe chapter 21 took even a little longer yet, and is something that he further contributed to this document that maybe was already a little bit in circulation to clarify this rumor that was floating around about him and his potential immortality, and to clarify questions people maybe had coming out of reading Matthew and being like, well, where does Peter stand? What do we do with him? He's a really prominent leader here in the early church. But when we go and read these accounts of what happened, I mean, it looks like things were left on kind of a sour note. So there's some debate about whether John 21 was part of the original thing that John wrote, or whether, I don't know how many people think this, but I suspect that John took a lifetime writing this, and that John 21, which feels a little bit redundant, it feels a little bit like he's re-emphasizing some points he really wanted to hit from chapter 20. Maybe this was something that he contributed to his own work, the Christian would say, also under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit a little bit later on. Ultimately, people can make of that whatever they want to, but it gives us a sense that coming out of the Gospels, Peter is restored. He is commissioned again, much like he was in Matthew 28 that we just spent the last week looking at, much like he was along with all the other disciples in Matthew chapter 10 with the missional discourse, the big open world quest, and much like he was somewhat specifically in Matthew chapter 16 after his confession of Christ. So that's where we are in terms of the relationship with the disciples, Peter in particular, coming out of the Gospels after what we get in Matthew is done. Then we turn the page into Acts. Now, like you probably know this stuff, but Acts is volume 2 of a 2-part work by Luke the physician. He was a traveling pal of Paul. He saw a whole bunch of the stuff that happened in Acts, and big chunks of Acts use we, us pronouns, indicating that Luke was along for that part of the trip. Other parts of Acts use they, them pronouns, indicating that he was not there for those parts of the trip. Well, Acts chapter 1 and 2, though there's only, I think, one specific mention of Matthew here, gives us a fuller sense of what happens to the main character, or the main point of view sharer that we have through the book of Matthew, and that is Matthew himself, the guy who's telling us what he remembered and what he saw. He gets mentioned once in Acts chapter 1 as being there with the other guys when they pick the replacement for Judas. Do they actually mention him by name? Is there a list of the disciples? There is, right? Yeah, okay, there is. I'm not crazy. It's in the middle of chapter 1. And Matthew, James, son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot. Okay, there all of that is. So before we get into the book of Acts and everything that we learn from that about what happened to all of these beloved characters, what happens to Matthew, like our friend who we've been hanging out with, before we get into that, we just kind of got to put a bow on all of the Gospels. And I think John 21 is really important in that regard. I could go and look at how Luke wraps up, but Luke has a little bit of a Venn diagram, a little bit of a crossfade, a little bit of an overlap, a little bit of redundancy between the end of his gospel and the beginning of his history of the early church in Acts. And so next time around, we'll look at Acts and see more about how the story unfolded after this point. But for all of you who were worried about Peter, when we left him weeping bitterly outside in the night and running away, hey, stuff worked out okay. And I think that was intoned from when Jesus comes back to life, and within like 5 or 6 words of talking again, he refers to the disciples collectively as his brothers. I mean, it's dude talk for it's forgiven. Let's move on to the next thing and go do what we need to do. But in John 21, we get it very explicitly spelled out. And I think that's a really reassuring detail in this whole story, because Peter's the character I relate to the most. I go big and I go stupid. And most of the dumb things he did, I would do, assuming I had the courage. Most of the really smart, brave, good things he did, I don't know that I would have done. So I think Peter handled it way better than I ever would have handled it, yet I still found him very relatable in his meteoric, up and down boisterousness, loudness, willingness to take a swing at it, but also willingness to fall on his face in front of everybody. And it's just cool to see that the Gospels wrap up with things being put back together with him, because it really, to me, undergirds even kind of the message of the parable of the talents. You remember that one in Matthew that we looked at, where it's like you got these 3 servants and the master's like, hey, here's a bunch of gold. This is a lot, silver, whatever. And you need to take it out and you need to invest it and you need to turn it into something. Well, investment is risk. Going out and trying to make money with someone else's money is risk. Implicit in the story is that what the master wanted his servants to go do is take a chance, take some big swings, maybe make some Peter-like mistakes, but trust the character of the master, that there is a safety net of grace and love and forgiveness and family and acceptance. And because of your trust in the character of the master, go take those big swings. And if it's not perfect, well, there's a mechanism for making that right. If you're reading Matthew with any kind of humanity or humility, you can't help but wonder how things play out with Peter, because if you look at what happened with Peter, you can't help but wonder, like, well, what if I was there? What would be my standing in the family? Now you know. More on what happened after next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.